Let me introduce, whoops, let me introduce them to you. First, we have Agnes Aylward, who is the curator and developer of the Lafcadio Hearn Gardens in Tramore, County Waterford. Agnes once was a senior Irish public servant, heavily involved in framing national and international science policies, and then later in major tourism initiatives, including the establishment of the Great Gardens of Ireland project, which sounds very interesting. And then beginning in 2013, Agnes, a native of County Waterford, devised and directed the development of the Lafcadio Hearn Japan Gardens project in Tramore, a homage to Japan's culture and folklore and its famous chronicler, Patrick Lafcadio Hearn. Today, the gardens are regarded by experts as the most authentic interpretation of the Japanese strolling garden experience in Ireland. They attract over 20,000 visitors a year. Agnes herself has been very moved by the depth of Japanese culture and its enormous difference to the West. She has gained a sense of a very spiritual people. A really striking aspect of Japanese culture for Agnes has been giri, which is the sense of duty to fulfill others' expectations, to serve with self-sacrificing devotion. Japanese thinking indeed does make an impression of many of us in the West who have had the opportunity to experience living in Japan or to visit Japan, as we shall also see with Jean Pasley. There is a very interesting word in Japanese that means harmony, and that word is wa. And from the little I have learned about Agnes and our other guest, Jean Pasley, I think they both have a good understanding of the Japanese wa, the idea of harmony. And something I learned just yesterday, connected with this idea of harmony, is that Jean has a black belt in Aikido, which is a soft martial art using a long stick instead of a sword. And this focuses on the way of the harmonious spirit. Jean is a writer from Dublin and spent almost 10 years in Japan. Her screenplays have won numerous awards. A feature film called The Bright Side, on which she was a co-writer, will be in cinemas in August. She wrote and directed the short film Ship of Souls, which was inspired by our third guest, so to speak, today, Patrick Lafcadio Hearn. And it will open in Galway this month. Jean's debut novel, The Black Dragonfly, published in April of this year, is, in the words of our great Irish playwright Frank McGuinness, a lavish, beautiful testimony to the life and achievements of Lafcadio Hearn. And it is a book I would highly recommend if you are already engaged with Lafcadio Hearn or Japanese culture, or if you would like to know more. Agnes and Jean, for me, know so much about Patrick Lafcadio Hearn, or his Japanese name, Koizumo Yakumo, and Japanese culture, that I feel I can very appropriately apply the term Japanologists to both of them. So let's begin, and hopefully we can bring you some sense of wa, or harmony, through their stories. As our friend Liz, a great storyteller here in Ireland, was saying at the beginning, stories are very important. For me, I see stories as a great channel for sharing experiences, knowledge, ideas, fun, encouraging thinking. And I sort of feel maybe we should begin our afternoon of storytelling by saying mukashi mukashi, which is once upon a time in Japanese. So first of all, Jean, the writer, is going to give us a brief overview of the life of the man of Lafcadio Hearn. Over to you, Jean.
You're muted.
You're still muted?
Okay, am I?
Yeah, that's you.
Here?
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Christine and Junko.
I'm sure you're all quite familiar with Hearn, so I'll be very brief, just in case there's anybody who isn't familiar with him. He was born in 1850 on a Greek island. His father was Irish, his mother was Greek, and he was christened Patrick Lafcadio Hearn. His middle name, Lafcadio, is a nod to the island where he was born. At the age of 2, they came to Dublin. And when he was 4 years old, his mother went back to Greece and left him with his Aunt Sarah. Aunt Sarah would have been about 70 at the time, and she had no children. So she really wouldn't have known how to mind a child. I'll talk about his childhood with Sarah later, but just very briefly, the sort of biography of his life. He went to school in England and France, and at the age of 19, he traveled to America. He spent 20 years in America. He became a journalist there. He lived in Cincinnati and New Orleans, and he spent time in the West Indies. And it wasn't until he was 40 that he traveled to Japan. So my book is really based, it's set in Japan, but it's interwoven with tales from his childhood and his time in America. So that's a very brief summary of his life. And by the way, as a child, he was called Patrick Hearn. It was sometime in America that he dropped his first name, and thereafter he became known always as Lafcadio Hearn.
Thank you, Jean. And now to Agnes and the Lafcadio Hearn Gardens in Tramore. And it is not often that one comes across gardens that are actually a living biography. That is, having different aspects reflecting the countries and the cultures that Lafcadio had connections with. So, Agnes, how did you meet this very unusual man?
Well, my first encounter with Lafcadio Hearn was through an Irish ambassador who lived who was based in Tokyo, and he was visiting me in my office in Dublin when I was dealing with tourism, and he mentioned this Irish man who was revered in Japan, and nobody in Ireland, or very few, knew anything about him. So we talked about him, and he lamented that Ireland didn't acknowledge him and said if we did, we might perhaps bring more Japanese visitors to Ireland. And then quite a long time after that, I had retired. I was back in my hometown in Tramore, and I had the chance to meet the great-grandson of Lafcadio Hearn, who visited Tramore, and he was doing a reconnaissance visit of Ireland, came with his wife, and so I had the chance to show him around the town. I found out a lot about Hearn in Hearn's time in Tramore, found out his Aunt Sarah had lived there, and during the day got the idea of honouring him finally in Ireland with a garden on the site that we happened to visit with Bon Koizumi that day. So that's where the idea came from, and I suppose the gardens owe their origin to the ambassador, Sean Ronan, who's now sadly passed away, and to the visit of the Koizumi family. So that's my first introduction to Hearn.
Thank you, Agnes. And now, Jean, where and how did your interest in Lafcadio begin? Was it when you were living in Japan or before that? And why did you go to Japan?
Well, I was in my 20s and I felt like I would travel, and I decided I would go far away and work my way back. So I just picked a faraway place, and that was Japan, and I traveled there. And I stayed for 7.5 years. I didn't mean to stay, but when you arrive in Japan, something happens and you become captivated. So when you're Irish, when you're a foreigner in Japan, it's an obvious question. Everybody will say to you, where are you from? And whenever I said Ireland, people would always say Lafcadio Hearn. And I had no idea who this man was. Sometimes they used his Japanese name. They would say, Koizumi Yakumo. And I would say, oh, who is this person? I have no idea. So it happened so often I became curious, and I bought one of his books. It was a book of ghost stories, and I read that, and it was very interesting. It the Japanese have a great tradition in ghost story, telling of ghost stories. Way back before they had air cooling systems, they used to gather around at night and scare the wits out of each other, telling each other ghost stories in an attempt to send shivers down their spine and cool down. So ghost stories are very popular there. So I read the book and I thought that's really interesting, but I really didn't think too much more about him at that point. It wasn't until I came back to Ireland and I found myself living very close to one of his childhood homes. And every day I have walking my dog, I have to pass the house and I would see the plaque. There's a big plaque on the wall that says, you know, Koizumi Yakumo Lafcadio Hearn lived here as a child. And I just couldn't stop thinking about him. So I bought more of his books, and these were different kind of books to the ghost stories. These were books about culture, society, very, very interesting, all his observations and insights into Japanese culture. And that's when I decided I should write something. And it's interesting that myself and Agnes, we were both discovering, we were both investigating Hearn at the same time. And I was doing it with a view to telling a story in words, and Agnes was doing it with a view to telling his story in landscape. And even though we were both working towards a similar sort of goal, we only met about a month ago. So that was a great, fortuitous meeting.
Yes, thank you. An interesting connection. And I think we'll go on to do more great things together. So having a Greek mother and an Irish father, as Lafcadio did, in 1850, it must surely have been rather unusual and probably brought lots of dramas, let alone the final separating of his parents. So what influences might his early years, particularly in Ireland, have had on his personal life? If we begin with Eugene and then Agnes.
Okay, so well, he was a half Greek, and he actually inherited his mother's complexion. So in the Ireland of that time, he would have been noticeably foreign. And as a little child, he was very small and he was quite sickly. And he would have been discriminated against from a very early age, maybe picked on by bullies. And he had no parents to stick up for him. So he was also, he was a small child taken from his mother in a big old house. It was cold, it was frightening. His aunt didn't know how to mind a child, and probably for his own safety, she locked him in his room every night. And he became terrified of ghosts and noises. These old houses, they creak at night. They make terrible sounds as the floorboards creak and shift. And he used to imagine ghosts coming down the chimney to get him. And so he describes his childhood as living in a state of perpetual fear, which he was able to mine in his writing of the ghost stories. So I think his childhood affected him deeply because he was an outsider. He was different. He was bullied at school. In school, and he was educated in England. So in school in England, he was probably discriminated against because he was Irish. He also went to school in France where they thought he was English and they hated him for that. And then I think he had a pretty rough childhood, and I think it made him defensive and reactive. He was very quick to react, and he had quite a vicious tongue when he felt it. Any perceived slight or criticism, he would react quite viciously. But it was a defensive thing.
Thank you, Jean. And Agnes?
Well, I just come in briefly on the last point that Jean mentioned there about his vicious tongue, which was used once or twice in letters to people, which remained and have been republished. In a way, it's a pity that these things have been perhaps highlighted. One was recently highlighted. I don't blame the writer for doing it in the Irish Times because it's a good read. But I thought it was a terrible pity. It was a letter Hearn wrote in anger to a publisher who had, I presume, just rejected something he had written. But he wrote so beautifully in other ways. And those of us who have had the luck to read his writing, the first writing I read was Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan. And for me, that brought Japan to life. That brought all the charm of Japan. There was such feeling in it. I actually started out preferring these writings, his journeys across Japan and his sociological accounts. They meant more to me than the ghost stories, which I understand the ghost stories mean more perhaps in Japan and elsewhere. But he was this person who was very sensitive to hurt, as Jean said, from a childhood of feeling abandoned, even though he did have an aunt who gave him an education and brought him up. I think one of the aspects of his childhood, and we tell our visitors that he lost his mother at the age of 4. We showed them the beach where he last saw his father at the age of 7. And this puts people in a very sympathetic frame of mind for this young boy who's going out into the world without some of the advantages. But it also gave me a huge feeling of protectiveness for this child, and the feeling that Tramore town, my town, where he had lived in the summers of his childhood and where he had been happy and had learned to swim and had developed a love of the ocean that stayed with him and appeared in his writing all his life, I thought we owed him something. So we should do something for him. And I found that all of the people who became involved in our project to create the garden all absorbed this feeling of a sort of love for Hearn, this boy who hadn't been loved enough when he was young. So we forgave him all the things he might have said later, and we concentrated on telling all the good things.
Thank you.
That's very interesting, Agnes, because when I wrote the book, I began in New York when he was 40, and a few people read the book and they said, I really don't like this man. And that was when I put the prologue in to try and explain something about his unfortunate childhood. So then when people read it, they have a much more sympathetic view of him, knowing what he went through as a child.
Yes. And it's interesting that you're both referring to this, the emotional impact on both of you and to other people involved. I'm only recently beginning to learn more about Lafcadio, and I find actually I quite like the man because of his interest in languages. He spoke several languages. He was interested in different cultures, really interested. And he was interested in different cuisines. And he obviously had great powers of critical thinking and his satirical writing too. So, but interesting how you sort of feel something reaching out to him. But I gather too that he probably wasn't a very easy man to deal with for his friends or his colleagues or his employers in whichever country he was living. And he had, as mentioned, lived, I think, in France and in the States and in the French West Indies and then Japan. And Japan, his culture would have been so different from anything he would have previously encountered. So how did he take to life and living in Japan, and how did he become known and respected in Japan? And if we begin with Jane and then move to Agnes.
Well, initially, I think it was very difficult for him. He arrived in Yokohama, and he was very disappointed when he arrived because it was beginning, the country had opened up about 20 years earlier, and already the Western influences were flooding in. And that wasn't what he went to Japan to find. He wanted to go to find the old Japan before it became, as he describes it, contaminated by the West. But then after a few months there, he moved into rural Japan to the city of Matsue, where he became a teacher. And from the moment he arrived there, he loved everything. He had a highly developed aesthetic sense, and old Japan was magnificent, beautiful, everything, all the design, the aesthetic, the houses, simplest things like little wooden bowls or chopsticks, they're all beautifully presented and beautifully made. And this would have pleased him immensely. He was very happy in Matsue, and he was teaching there. And at that time, he would have been one of the only Westerners to ever arrive in that remote spot. Anybody before him, they would have been missionaries, and they would have been trying to convert the Japanese. So that would not, Hearn wasn't there to change them. He was there to study them, to learn from them, and to write about them, to tell the West about the Japanese, not to criticize and change them. So he did have an ongoing exchange in the newspapers there. So he became a little bit known. And then sometimes he gave speeches. They used to be translated and put in the papers. So gradually, slowly but surely, Japanese people became aware of him. And then with his first book, the one Agnes referred to, Glimpses of an Unfamiliar Japan, that's a beautiful collection of essays describing the culture in such a true, it's flattering, but it's true in such a real and beautiful way that Japanese people, they couldn't help but be like him for this.
Yeah, and Agnes?
Yes, I agree with everything Jean has said there. Just to add something to it, I think it was extremely lucky that he went to Matsue in the first year or so of being in Japan, because in Matsue City, old Japan was there. The culture hadn't changed, and the buildings and the people were going by the customs of the older times, probably more than in the Tokyo area. He loved that. He had a very good friend, a Japanese teacher, who introduced him to his wife, Setsu, who he married quite soon in the first year or so of being there. And he began to teach in the school. And I think through his teaching in the school, he became loved, and he grew to know Japan and to love his pupils. He learned a lot from his pupils. He asked them a lot about their lives and why they thought this way and why they didn't do it another way. And he appreciated their customs and values, and they knew it. And he wasn't bringing in Western values, and he wasn't coming in as a colonial power, bringing in a better way, as some other visitors had done. So he used that time as a teacher, not used in a deliberate way, but it was useful to him to learn more about the culture. He really learned from those students. And so much when he left, he only stayed a very short time, unfortunately, in Matsue, because the climate was much too cold for him and his health was poor even then. But when he left Matsue, there's a wonderful story of over 200 pupils. All the students, they all went down to the porch to see him off, and there's a beautiful farewell as they wave him out of Matsue. So that's, I think, my answer to that particular question.
And Agnes, you mentioned his wife, Setsuko, and she would appear to have had considerable, but probably quiet, unobtrusive influence on him. She encouraged him with his interest in ghost stories and folk tales and so on. What sort of role did she play in his life? Maybe if we take Agnes and then Jean.
Well, yes, we both sort of followed her path, but there's a lovely book which I have called Hearn in My Heart, where a Western writer, in every second chapter, he uses some of Setsuko's own, well, she's Setsu and Setsuko. There's a little, both names are used. Setsu was her registered name, and I think the more formal name, and that's used in some works, and Setsuko in other ones. So I think we use both of them. Anyway, I've become more used to using Setsu. She used to tell him stories. I have a little paragraph here where she said, on quiet evenings, after Hearn had finished his writing for the day, I would lower the wick of the lamp and begin telling him ghost stories. And then she went on to talk about their experience as she told stories and became frightened. And sometimes she frightened herself so much, she would wake up having nightmares. And they both got so frightened, they had to leave it for a few days and come back to it again. But she researched and went out and found stories for him and gave them to him, and they worked on it together. So she was of great help in her own quiet way, and Jean describes this very well, in her own quiet way of influencing him, and I think influencing his work.
And Jean?
And she also, as well as everything Agnes said is correct, and she also helped him in a practical way. Like, she made sure the house was quiet when he was working. He was very intolerant. He couldn't tolerate any noise while he was working. Setsu made sure the house was quiet. He also was, I'm sure everybody knows, he was blind in one eye from an accident at school, and his other eye was very poor eyesight. So he used to have to lean over the pages to see the writing. So she had a special desk made for him, a big tall desk, so he didn't have to lean quite so far. And she also had a stove put in his study in Kumamoto, because he was very sensitive to cold. She had the stove put in with its own chimney, and she glazed the doors. Most of the doors would have been sliding shoji doors with paper insets. She had them glazed over as well, so that he could be permanently warm. He couldn't work in the cold. He said, "Cold shrivels the little wings of thought," or some lovely expression like that. So she really looked after him. She supplied the base for him.
And they really came to love each other. Some writers don't believe that. I've forgotten whose book, who didn't think they did, but I've seen the final letters that Hearn wrote to her before he died. Beautiful. Oh, little Mama San, he called her. I mean, how beautiful.
Yes,
and,
I agree. And that was one of the reasons I wrote the book as a piece of fiction. I wanted her at the heart of the story. It's an unconventional love story. I mean, really, when you look back, he married Setsu primarily because he was cold. And his friend Nishida-san in Matsue told him he couldn't live by himself. He needed somebody to mind him and keep him warm at night. He initially resisted this offer because he thought it was not the right way to go about getting married. But when he met Setsu, he liked her. And I think their love grew slowly through the marriage. It is a lovely love story.
Yeah, lovely. Right, now moving on to his interpretive essays on Japanese thinking and approach to life, which was actually, I think, his main reason initially to move to Japan from the US. He was going to write for American newspapers. Pardon me. And I know from my own very first experience of Japan in 1998, the country and the people, fascinating, but puzzling, frustrating, enlightening, so many things going on. How was it for Lafcadio? How did the writing of these particular articles go for him, and how were they received in Japan and outside Japan? And if we start with you, Jane, and then to Agnes.
Sure. So he went to Japan. He actually wasn't commissioned to write. He wanted an advance from Harper's to write, but they wouldn't give it to him. They said they would publish what he wrote after he sent the work. So he was quite out on a limb there financially. He didn't have an income. Teaching wasn't his first love. He would prefer to have devoted all his time to writing, but he had to have an income. So he taught and wrote at the same time. I think some people say that part of the reason his powers of observation were so finely tuned was because of his very poor eyesight. He really studied things, and his wonderful writings on the gardens and insects and things like that, he would have studied them through a monocular. So he didn't like writing fiction. He didn't like having to delve into his own emotions to create stories. He much preferred to study and observe, think and write. That was his preferred mode of writing.
Thank you, Anne.
So he had endless material. Sorry, Christine. He had endless material in Japan because the country had been closed for 200 years. He describes it as not just going to a very different and unique culture, but he was also stepping back in time. So he had a lot of material to work on.
Endless material, and we could probably talk a very long time about it. I'll just say briefly, his greatest work, the one that had most influence afterwards, I think, on the West, is his Japan, an attempt at interpretation. And that was written originally as a series of essays that he was giving on Japan and the whole virtues and practices of loyalty to family and to emperor and to society, explaining Japanese culture to people who were not Japanese in an absolutely brilliant way. The series of lectures in America never came about. So in the end, he adapted it to a book, and it was his final work and published, I think, within a couple of months of his death. So that is, in my view, the most serious and influential work outside of Japan. But other ones were, the charm of his work was immense. And I saw somewhere in the preface to one of the many books about him, a comment by a former Japanese prime minister when asked, do you know about Koizumi Yakubo? And he said, yes, his stories made my childhood. So that's like an amazing statement. One story that made a huge impact on me, and I'll come to it later when we come to the gardens, is his essay In a Japanese Garden. I didn't know he had written that, and when I started the idea of the garden and searched to find if Hearn had ever an interest in Japanese gardens, I found this fantastic essay, and it's worth reading in itself. I recommend it to everybody. It's actually published in his first book, Glimpses, One Familiar Japan, but it was published for the Atlantic magazine in 1892 initially.
Oh, a lot of things for those of us who are getting more interested in to explore. Now moving on really to Jean's book. I remember when in Japan seeing dragonflies flying around and, beautiful iridescent colors and so on. So I was quite intrigued when Junko first introduced Jean's book, The Black Dragonfly, to me. And I was wondering why black? And Jean, I found your book totally fascinating regarding Koizumi Yakumo's story. And also, I have to say, I could identify very much with the references to what Japanese collective thinking and society expects of people, and so on. I could recognize some of the aspects that I encountered. But Jean, tell us about your motivation and research for your Black Dragonfly, and then maybe you'll read an excerpt for us.
Sure. So as I said earlier, when I came back, I was living close to his house, and I started reading the books Agnes has just mentioned, in particular his last book, Japan, An Attempt at Interpretation. It is absolutely brilliant. And I read most of his books, probably not all of them, but I used to feel very homesick for Japan because he brings it to life so clearly. And I'd lived there, and I would read them and go, oh yes, that's what that was about, and oh, I wish I'd known that at the time. And if I'd known that at the time, I would have been able to enjoy Japan more, or I would have understood it better. So I was learning about Japan in retrospect, and it was all my own experience was becoming clear to me after the fact, if that makes any sense. So I started reading the books, and every time I came across something that amused me or interested me, or I thought was funny, or even something I thought was horrible, I put a little post-it on the book, and I ended up with a pile of books covered in post-its. So I work as a screenwriter. That's my main work. And I tried writing a film script of that using this material. I'd done so much research, and it didn't really work. And then I tried a play. And then I thought, no, I have to be inside Hearn's head. I want people to experience Japan with him as he experiences it, as opposed to relating about it later. So I thought I would try a book. It's my first book. And that's how I came to write the book.
Oh, yeah. An interesting path. And have you got an excerpt to hand?
I do. I have a little extract here. It's talking about the gardens. He had a beautiful house in Matsue. They have it preserved as it was when he lived there. It's beside the castle moat, and it's really beautiful. And it was surrounded by gardens, and he loved to sit in the garden. So he's living in this house with Setsuko and her grandfather and her mother, and there's a couple of maids there. But he likes to sit in the garden, and he's in the garden one day with the grandfather, who's called Oji-san. And don't forget, Hearn's eyesight is very poor, so he can't see that much without help. A black dragonfly appeared and hovered around the old man before coming to rest on his knee, with its long, dazzling body poised delicately and its fine wings spread out ready for flight. Oji-san bowed to the insect and greeted it. "I've never seen a black dragonfly before," said Hearn. "He was probably once blue. The color rubs off during mating, leaving black patches," said Oji-san. "By the look of him, he was fond of the ladies." "Really?" said Hearn, wondering if he was serious. "I had a great time when I was young," said Oji-san, with an amused glance in Hearn's direction, "but I can't even find it anymore." Oji-san laughed. Hearn found himself laughing too. The dragonfly propelled itself into the air and flitted around Oji-san. "I love to watch them darting about," said Oji-san. "They're so fast. Sometimes you can hardly see them, but they can see you. They can see all around them." "Lucky them. I can hardly see in even one direction," said Hearn. "They're not so lucky. They only get to fly around in this lovely world for a short period," said Oji-san. "So they make the most of it. They live most of their lives underwater. And when they're ready to change, they stick their heads up out of the water and remain very still while they adapt to breathing air. It takes them a while to get used to their new surroundings. And then they shed their old skin and fly away, leaving the watery past behind." Hearn had learned how to listen carefully in Japan, and he knew that this was Oji-san's way of telling him to move on, forget the West, settle down and have children. "I understand," said Hearn. "Good," said Oji-san. The dragonfly flew away. "Farewell," said Oji-san, bowing ever so slightly to the departing insect. "I'll see you again soon." The old man remained very still, staring off into the distance. "No man dies so utterly as the man without children," he said, and then he let out a long, weary sigh. 5 days later, Oji-san died peacefully in his sleep. He had bequeathed all his earthly possessions, his swords, and his suit of armor to Setsuko to pass on to her sons. After the cremation, Setsuko and her mother searched through the ashes for a little bone called Hotoke-san, Lord Buddha. The future of the deceased could be predicted by the shape of the bone. It was important that they find it. If Oji-san's next life was destined to be one of happiness, the bone would look like a small image of Buddha. But if the bone was ugly or shapeless, the next birth would be an unhappy one. They found the bone in the area near the throat, and it had the most auspicious shape, taking the form of Santai, 3 Buddhas. This was a guarantee of great happiness for the departed soul of Oji-san, and it afforded the family considerable consolation for the loss of their beloved grandfather.
Beautiful, beautiful. And again, something to whet your appetite if you haven't already read the Black Dragonfly. Thank you, Jean. Now, we've had a look at Koizumi Yakumo's life, real and imagined to some extent. And now let's move on to the Lafcadio Hearn Gardens for a closer look with Agnes. The boy Patrick really enjoyed spending his childhood summers in the water in Tramore. And Agnes, I think, is going to share some slides of the beautiful garden with us as well. So over to you, Agnes.
Thank you very much, Christine. The first slide we're looking at shows you the logo of the gardens. And the byline, Ireland's Bridge to Japan, which is truly what Lafcadio Hearn is for me and for many people in Ireland. And our logo, designed by our creative director, Janet Carey, it shows the bridge between two wonderful sea, what shall I say, icons. The Itsukushima Shrine in Japan, world famous, and in Tramore on the headland, the Metalman pillars. So we have two sea shrines and the oceans between. So this is our starting point. And the idea, as I mentioned earlier, for the gardens started in 2012 when Bon Koizumi, great-grandson of Hearn, visited Ireland. We turned the first sod in 2017, on the 27th of June of 2014, and we opened 1 year later to the public. We had to go very quickly because we had some funding from a Japanese fund which had to be used in 1 year, and the purpose of the funding was to help promote Japanese culture abroad. So our garden has this as one of its main objects. As we've said, it's biographical, and it tells through its topography and rocks and planting the story of Hearn and many of the legends. So we'll just move on then to the first of the slides. Here we have a photograph of the bridge, again because of Ireland's bridge to Japan. As I said earlier, the whole idea was inspired partly because of Hearn's essay, or I should say the idea was fostered, and I was given comfort and courage because of Hearn's essay in a Japanese garden. So we will move to the next one. Here you see the little boy, aged 8, Patrick Hearn, and his grandaunt Sarah. And we don't know where the image was taken. It may have been in Tramore. We show it to visitors in the very first of our gardens. We have a series of 11 gardens in sequence within the garden grounds. And this is in our Victorian garden, which is in the next slide. So here you see in the very first section, this little garden, formal, walled, colourful garden, the type of gardening style used when Hearn was a boy in Victorian Ireland or Victorian Britain. And there we introduce the visitors to his childhood and tell them why he's rooted in Tramore. So now we have our next slide. And this is the transition garden. It's a sort of courtyard area between the boyhood Victorian garden and then the adult life of Hearn. And in it, as people gather, they can look at the pathways and the rocks, and they can see the seashore and the playground of his youth, or if they look more deeply, they can see symbols such as the pathway. You don't see it very clearly here, but it's a large koi fish in the stonework swimming through. Rocks on one side depict the islands of Japan and so forth. And people are led to, we have guides which explain all this to people. So we move then from the transition garden into the American Prairie Garden. This is at its most colourful in summertime, and that picture was taken one summer. Hearn spent 20 years almost in America, starting in Cincinnati and moving to New Orleans. So because of our climate, we use the type of plants that would live in Cincinnati, and they're all natives of Ohio, all the plants we have in that area. And the garden flows, the pathway flows, as does the River Mississippi, moving from Cincinnati to New Orleans, which was part of Hearn's journey. And then we move to the next one is a little interloper, this picture. It's not part of the chronological story of the gardens, but a tree is planted just in that area by Her Imperial Highness, Princess Takamado, who visited us in 2017, just 4 years ago. And I think it's useful to show it because it shows how Hearn is important in Japan, that on the imperial visit, which was only 3 days, an entire day was spent traveling to Tramore to visit the gardens. And we were so honored that day by that visit of Princess Takamado. So we move on, and in the next slide, we're back to the chronological order, and this is our little Greek garden area. You can see an olive tree and Greek Mediterranean plants and so on. We introduced the idea of the Greek garden at this point in the story because, as Jean said earlier, it was only when he was in America and during the American journey that Hearn became Lafcadio after his birthplace. So at that point, we tell our visitors a little bit more about his mother and bring them flashback to his youth. On the left side of that picture, you can see a Fujidana or wisteria frame, which is our pathway to Japan. So now we're leaving the West and we're moving into Japan. And the next slide, we're in the Japanese section of the garden, and almost immediately you find this little tea house and a tea garden. The tea garden with the hand-carved basin and lamp were made by visiting a Japanese gardener, and the tea house made to authentic Japanese design, made by a very skilled carpenter on our own staff. And we've just moved to the next slide. There we tell people about the tea ceremony, and here we have a wonderful photograph courtesy of the Koizumi family, Hearn's descendants. And in this, Setsu is there at the table performing the tea ceremony to some guests. And she learned to perform the tea ceremony after Hearn's death. I presume it was because she needed more income, because there was no longer a salary or a pension coming into the household. So I think it's a very interesting old photograph. And we move to the next one, which is back to our garden and our tea house. And on its opening day, we had a tea ceremony performed for our visitors. A visiting lady from Japan who's performing the tea ceremony for her friend who's living in Ireland and is smiling at her. So we do use that tea house to have tea ceremonies, but not now in COVID times. On the right, what we have instead is a video of a tea master performing the ceremony in Matsue in Japan. And now we move to the next slide. There are two pictures here. On the left, there's a cluster of stones. They're called the Koizumi stones. They're a very important central part of the garden. A spring rises at that point, and we discovered that the name Koizumi means a little spring. And at that point where the spring rises, which is the center, the source of the natural water, we commemorate Hearn becoming a Koizumi, taking the name Koizumi, becoming a Japanese citizen, and there's a cluster of stones which represent Hearn and his wife and his family. And then to the right of it, there's another rock feature with planted Ophiopogum on it, and that is a turtle. You can just see it from the back of it. It would be better viewed from the front. And there we start telling legends. We start recounting some of the legends, and the one that's told there is the story of Urashima Taro and the fisher boy who journeys to the home of the Sea King on the back of a turtle, and a story recounted in many ways, and one of the people who told it was Hearn. Also in that area we tell another beautiful legend of a place Hearn visited, the Cave of the Children's Ghosts, and that's it's not a story he invented, but it's a story about a place where he went, and it's a beautiful story too. So we move on to the next one. And this is a picture of our stream garden. So it's the water flowing down from the source that we saw earlier. And you start seeing some of the color and some of the Japanese planting in the gardens. And we move on again to the next slide. Another view of the Soribashi Bridge, and little gentle curved bridge is the meaning of the word. And this is a most popular place in the garden for our visitors. Many photographs there, many wedding photographs. People really like it. And we also describe it, well, it's in a way, it's a link to another aspect of Hearn's, of Japan and Japanese legends, because it goes across into the woodlands the woodland part of the garden. So we're moving across to the woodlands next. And we inherited on the site some old trees, and we underplanted them, and we interspersed a lot of Japanese cherries, the sakura, which is the probably most loved tree in Japan. Our ones are still babies, but they're beginning to blossom beautifully. And this photo was a couple of years old, and this year the blossoms were stronger and bigger, and they will grow more beautiful every year. In the woodlands, we tell ghost stories. There are many great stories about tree spirits in Japan, humans who give their lives to save a wonderful tree, or trees which come to life in human form, and we can tell those ones in a natural way in the woodlands. So we'll move to the next slide. And we're moving to the Gardens of Peace and Harmony. I apologize if I'm going rather quickly because I'm conscious of time. The Gardens of Peace and Harmony, we have 2 more ponds in the garden, and in that area where it's beautiful and the planting is lush, we tell visitors about Hearn's happiness in his marriage, and finally his happiness in Japan when he becomes an acknowledged, accepted writer, and he becomes professor of English at Tokyo University, and his first child, Kazuo, has been born, and he's extraordinarily happy about that. And also in that area, before we move on, I should mention that at one of the ponds, we tell the story of the Fountain of Youth, the one that Junko showed us so beautifully earlier on. And in fact, the day Princess Takamado visited, our tour guide recounted that story at that point in the garden. So now we're going to move to the next slide, which is of another beautiful Japanese structure that's been built. It's a little azumaya, and this little pavilion is also at the latter end of the Garden of Peace and Harmony. And it is a place of harmony because modern wedding ceremonies happen there. Young people come in and they're married there. And we have lovely events there. And we hosted Jean Pasley a few nights ago, and she read from her book there to an enchanted audience. So it's a lovely part of our gardens. Just past it, we tell the story of a living God, because we have a steep path moving on, and we tell the story of Tanabata. We have planted some corn, this Milky Way. So we work in the legends and the stories of Japan in as natural a way as possible, and people learn about them without having to work too hard at it. So we have 2 more slides. Just the next one is Journey's End. So here we've completed our circle. The tour around the garden is in a circuitous route, and at the end people come to the point where we tell them about the end of Hearn's life. We have a beautiful bronze of him, a gift from the city of Matsue. Only 2 of them, these bronze in the world, made by a Japanese sculptor, and one I think is in Matsue, and we are honored to have the other one. And beside that, there's a small Zen garden with some wonderful rocks, much bigger than they seem in that image there. And here we commemorate the work of a poet of the Tramore area, Waterford city poet, Sean Dunn. And he wrote a wonderful tribute called A Shrine for Lafcadio Hearn, in which he says, one of the lines afterwards, he was a story still told, set firmly as rocks in a Zen garden. That poem came our way as we were developing the garden, and it just fitted in so beautifully so that we have commemorated Sean Dunn, and his poem is reproduced in that area. So visitors have completed the circuit, and then they move back up to the beginning, and I'll just show you the very last slide, which is a view over Tramore Bay from our reception area where people can relax and have a coffee or a tea. And down below, it's hill, sloping garden. Down below is the beach where Hearn last saw his father. It's a wonderful 3-mile long beach, and there are sand dunes at the far end, and people just enjoy sitting there looking over the ocean. So in that way, we've introduced visitors to Lafcadio Hearn and to the story of his life. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Agnes. And Jean, do you want to say something briefly there before we conclude?
No, I had a wonderful time in the gardens. It's a truly beautiful venue, and I was very, very happy to be able to talk about Hearn and read the book, and everybody should go there. It's really beautiful.
So I would like to thank Agnes and Jean for a really very fascinating exchange this afternoon. And I am still left with the impression that there is much more to go, that there is more to share. And hopefully our friends throughout the world, from Japan, England, Ireland, wherever you might all be, that hopefully your appetites have been whetted too. And I imagine you can see why I felt the term Japanologist could be used for both Agnes and Jean. And we hope that you have gleaned a little of the spirit of this interesting man, who is really a bridge for us in the 21st century between Ireland and Japan. So thank you very much, Agnes and Jean, and for everyone for listening. And I'll hand back to Junko. Hopefully.
Thank you.
You're there.
So, thank you, Agnes and Jean and Christine, that brilliant talk. And we have almost the time is out, but I'd like to introduce that soon that Jean's new film will be shown at the Galway Film Fair online, and it will be that July 24th. But you can already buy the ticket at the Eventbrite, and I copied the link at the chat box, so you can three dots at the chat box. If you click it, you can see that the save chat. If you save chat, you can save that all that links I put at the Zoom chat box. And so the
sorry, Junko, Jean, what's your full name, Jean? Because it just says Jean on your.
Jean Pasley, Pasley, and the film is Ship of Souls.
Okay. I thought it was very interesting that he was an outsider. I've written a lot about Patrick Kavanagh, the Irish writer. He sounds very similar. A bad-tempered genius.
True. Yes. But he mellowed in Japan. It's a pity they couldn't send Patrick Kavanagh to
I know.
Japan.
I was just thinking. I think Paddy could have done with a little
bit of mellowing.
Yes, definitely. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I now checked the chat box, but not so particular questions like Stephen wrote what school, but I cannot catch that what.
It was Ushaw. It's a boarding school in England called
Ushaw.
Ushaw, I think it's called.
Right. Okay. Right. So the time is over, and I was thinking this is the event followed by our annual general meeting. So the event itself we can finish, but and I was thinking of showing another video while the break, but might be better to leave this Zoom as it is for 10 minutes or so. And I find a lot of people already involved in that the projects of Lafcadio Hearn, Koizumi Yakumo, or Japanese ghost stories, or more music about Lafcadio Hearn. If you can exchange your own project or etc. directly, it might be more useful. What do you think? So just until 2:30, And of course, if you're busy, you can leave, just leave the Zoom. What do you think? Is there any comment or question?
So to come back at 2:30 to watch a video, is that right, Junko?
No, not. I'm giving up the video and just
Okay.
Directly, I'll say, correspond with Jean and Agnes or participants to each other. What do you think? Everybody is shy. What do you think? Stevenson, did you already show the books? Stevenson, the books you showed.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. I didn't know, because there's another Stephen here, and I wasn't sure
Right.
him. Yeah, no, I've some. I work as, like Liz, I work as a professional storyteller, and I've got some of his books here. This is the Penguin one, and I also have this one here, which is quite well known. But I found this one, which is quite interesting. It's by Catrian Ross. I don't know if you ever heard of that person, of Japanese ghost stories. And yeah, just I found these beautiful illustrations of ghost stories, Japanese ghost stories. They're really amazing, because they're quite terrifying, even though they're, you know, the style. There's one particular one here, and it's I don't know if you've seen the famous Japanese horror movie Ring. It's very similar to Sadako, you know.
Yeah.
And I love these illustrations. I show them to the children when I'm telling, you know, Japanese ghost stories. Beautiful stuff. And I thought I wanted to show you something. I think the Japanese people will appreciate this. I even have a Lego Sadako and her television, and she's holding the video. So I thought you might appreciate that.
Yeah.
So listen, thank you very much, everybody. It was great.
Yeah, we have to do that. The Japanese ghost story.
Well, they're the best. In my books, they're the best ghost stories in the world are the Japanese.
Right. Okay, right. So,